right. All right. That doesn't.
Well, hello, everybody. Like Pastor Eric said, my name is Hannah. I'm Dawn's daughter in church, and pretty much all of you know Dawn. I feel like she's quite the personality. But I've been born with cerebral palsy, which is a neurological condition. And in my case, like all things, I mean, CP is usually a spectrum, but in my case, my disability makes it so that I can't stand or walk on my own. I have pretty severe spasticity, which is tightness of the muscles. So every time I talk, like right now, my legs all kick in like little boosters, like they need to help with things, and they really don't. It's like a 3-year-old trying to help cooking, but really they just make it worse. But they're adorable, they're unique. And so my right side is a lot weaker than my left as well. Obviously, though, cognitively I'm not affected, which we can talk a little bit more about when we talk about experiences and assumptions. But because ableism, or the belief that disability is a fundamentally bad thing and that people who are able-bodied are superior, is such a broad topic, I figured it would be appropriate to talk about ableism in the church and kind of my own experiences with religion and how that shifted over time as I've gotten. I have a little note too. So when I was little, I very much internalized all of the like Sunday school messages of Jesus is gonna come again, Jesus is gonna heal you, it's gonna be great. And when I was really little, I knew that I was different, but it didn't really feel like I was fundamentally an outsider or anything. But then at about 7, during a dance unit where I, got to watch all the other kids moving in ways that my body couldn't, it really started to hit me that, no, I'm fundamentally different than other people, and as far as I can tell, Jesus isn't gonna come down from the sky and heal me, and that was really devastating. I had a very long cry session with my mother where I said, this is like a nightmare and I can't wake up. And from that point, I was very bitter. Because, you hear all these stories about God healing other people and why couldn't I be healed? Was there something different about me, etc. So that turned to resentment. And going through middle school is not fun for anyone, but especially when you have a disability, there's an added level of social exclusion. I basically spent 3 years eating lunch alone, or even when my case managers tried to make sure that other people sat with me, those other students weren't really engaged. They kind of thought that sitting with the disabled person was enough and that they didn't really have to engage them. So I was very, very socially isolated, and around that time started to develop really, really severe depression. I wanted to be in heaven, I wanted to be normal, I wanted to not experience the things, the isolation and the discrimination that I would experience of not being able to access things in the same ways as my peers, not being able to certain places, always having to plan 10 steps ahead about what adaptations might have to be made. So I ended up in a partial hospitalization program for depression as a teenager. And when I was there, one of the counselors discovered that my family was Christian. And during one of the family therapy sessions, when we were talking about my suicidality, she looked at me and said, if you kill yourself, you're going to hell. Which isn't a great thing to say to a 15-year-old with already low self-esteem. Not a great theological background either, and I tried to push back, where does that say that? And, isn't Jesus love and all those good things? And she eventually apologized for that, but it some fundamentally mixed feelings about Christianity. On the one hand, I wanted a God that loved and accepted me, but on the other hand, I didn't like the life that I was living. And the idea that, disability is some cross to bear, or that, we exist to teach other people, about what it's like to be in the human experience. Well, I've chosen to take that path because I've been groomed for it, quite honestly, and I know that other people don't want to take that path, and it makes more sense for me to do it than for somebody else who doesn't want to. That perception that that's what we exist for, was really hard for me. And then the idea that disability is tied to sin, right? That, it's possession or the devil or something. That was also really difficult because I was always kind of confused by that fact, because my body is not evil. My body just struggles. And so to have it be this kind of dichotomy between good and bad and how that plays out. Logically, I knew that ideas linking disability to sin were flawed, but it's still hard to this day when I hear healing narratives to think, is it not somehow my fault? And that's a thing that still sticks with me even as, a grown adult. Now, when I got to high school, the end of high school and college, my perception of disability began to shift thanks to some really great mentors that I had, Tess Farmer, who goes to this church, being one of them, where they taught me that it's not my body that's the issue. It's the way that society is structured and refuses to include my body that's the problem. And that would be what we call the social model versus the medical model. So the idea that the issue, or a lot of the issues that people with disabilities face, stem from the world around us rather than an inherent impairment in and of itself. So as that perception kind of changed, so did my understanding of, how we talk about the Bible and how we talk about healing narratives. And to this day, healing narratives have the potential to really do a lot of psychological damage for me. Like when I know that one is coming, I have to do a lot of psyching myself up, you are loved, you are valued, giving myself permission to lead because I don't know how it's going to be represented. It's still a fragile subject for me. And on the one hand, you want to make space because even though I've gone from a place of wanting to be normal so badly to no longer really wanting to be healed and wanting the world to include people like me instead, there's still plenty of other people who I know for a fact, would wish not to have their disability. And so because there's so much diversity within the disabled community, you don't want to exclude anyone by the way that you talk about it, but the unfortunate side effect of that is that often means we don't talk about it at all, or we talk about it in really flawed ways. And I remember when I was in college, I got to go to the Parliament of the World Religions in Toronto, and there was a panel that I attended with a Jewish rabbi, a Seventh-day Adventist, and one other person of faith. And one of the people stood up and started talking about how God had healed them from X, Y, and Z, and it was just like, oh boy, we're turning this into a test. Okay. And so, after the event, I had planned to just go up and ask the Jewish rabbi about disability in the Jewish worldview and whether we have this perception that disability will be healed in the afterlife, or that disability is somehow inferior. And I meant to ask that in a cool, collected manner. That's not how it came out. It turns out that I was really, taking to heart these words that this person had said about, God somehow was working me, yada, yada, yada. And so I was feeling really vulnerable, and I started sobbing as I'm saying this. And this rabbi was basically like, no, that's not image of worldview. You're made in the image of God. That includes disability. You don't have to be healed. You're fine as you are. And honestly, that's the most compassionate response that I've ever gotten from a religious person, was from a Jewish rabbi, which I realize is kind of odd and potentially will get me labeled as a heretic. But yeah. So that was really eye-opening for me. And like I said, everyone with disability is different, and we all have different experiences, but I'm not comfortable generally with the church as an institution because of how we talk about bodies that are different than us, and how we, don't bring up any sort of difference generally. And how we like to talk about inclusion and creating a better world, but a lot of the times we don't practice what we preach. And so I'm kind of what I refer to as an uneasy Christian. I like to keep God at a sort of healthy distance, because if I get too close and if I start really thinking about, well, was disability planned, and is it somehow my calling to, help other people? It all just kind of feels sort of icky because, like I've said before, people with disabilities shouldn't have to exist to teach the able-bodied things. That's a lot of times what happens, and we see that repeated with a lot of other minority and marginalized groups, but it shouldn't have to be that way. And so when we conceptualize why bad things or different things happen to people, it can be really harmful really quick to come to sort of easy cookie cutter solutions. And so I kind of keep myself at a distance when it comes to all of that. And so what can you do as individuals to support people with disabilities and kind of reshape what we think of when we think of disability? I think the biggest thing is ask questions. Not everybody is going to be as open as I am about disability and about their experiences, but I have no filter. No question is and so I would rather you ask those questions to me so that the answers can get out in the open than perpetually, wonder about something, but then be too afraid to ask it and inadvertently maintain some stereotypes accidentally. I think also the really important thing is we need to change how we talk to children about diversity and ability and difference in general. When I had the opportunity to teach at Bible school this past year, we had Alan come and speak about his experience with blindness, and that was really good. But there was one of the facilitators had said something like, we're all blind in our own way to the kids, which is gross. No, we're not. That's like, I get the metaphor, it's sweet, but it's two very distinct things to be like actually disabled and to be ignorant. I mean, they can overlap, but it's two different experiences. And then she had also, with the little kids, had said, let's all pretend to be blind, which is an interesting idea. I get that it's an exercise to foster empathy, but a lot of times what happens with those things is we get really narrow perceptions of what disability must be like. And because that's not our lived dominant experience, when we only engage in that activity for like 15 minutes, we're like, oh my gosh, this is so hard. How can people do it? Their life must be agonizing. No. Not inherently. Everyone has their own experiences, but a lot of people with blindness and a lot of other disabled people are thriving and are really used to living that life. And so I would say that we need to teach children not to fear disability or difference, but to explore it, to ask questions, to understand what this means for different people. It's not something that's scary, although sometimes it can be, but just because someone's different, it doesn't mean that their life is bad. And that's, I think, one of the really big common misconceptions about disability. And the other thing that we can do is obviously listen to a variety of disabled perspectives. Once you know one disabled person, you know one disabled person. Language can be something that's really tricky. I really like disabled person, which kind of flies in the face of the traditional understanding of saying person with a disability, putting the person first so that their disability does not define them, which I understand and agree with on one hand, but my disability does define me in a number of important ways. It defines how I move throughout the world, what kind of access I get, how people make assumptions about me, particularly about my cognitive ability. And so to pretend that it is a separate entity, a different part of me that exists fully, by itself and not in connection with the rest of me is flawed. But some people really prefer that language because they don't want to only be defined by their disability. So everyone has different preferences, and it makes it complicated, but it makes discussions really rich. And so other things that you can do, listening to podcasts, reading books. I know that those of you who have been in Pastor Eric's book club have read Sitting Pretty. There are other books out there. Thankfully, the genre is growing for disabled memoirs. Laughing at My Nightmare by Shane Burka is one. I'm trying to think of others. There are several YouTubers, Molly Burke, who is a motivational speaker and social media influencer with retinitis pigmentosa. Shane Burka, again, has his own YouTube channel. For amputees, there's a channel called Footless Joe, who, talks about her experiences with disability, but also with abuse in the church and the complicated feelings that arise out of that. Basically, never stop learning and don't be afraid to ask questions. That's the only way that we're going to change from a model of disability as a deficit to our world as being a deficit, right? And creating worlds that lift people up rather than tear them down because it's a deficit. So I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions. I can go into more specific stories, but I wanted to make sure that those of you who had things that you wanted to ask had the time and the space to do so.
Get your water.
Oh, come on now, I know you have questions. Yes.
The ADA is the American Disability Act. I can't remember when that was passed.
1991.
And so, how has that related to you? How has that affected your life?
I am really fortunate in that I don't know anything different. I know in the past there used to be so-called ugly laws where you could actually remove people from public settings because their existence would be too upsetting for the other people. So you saw a lot of people with disabilities, if they could get into restaurants physically, being removed on those grounds. You saw a lot of institutionalization in inhumane settings, particularly in like the 60s and 70s and 80s. And so we've shifted away from that now towards a more community-based model. But I'm here to tell you that just because we have a law that theoretically makes things accessible doesn't mean that the world is accessible. And I think everyone in every minority or marginalized group will tell you the same thing. Just because we're theoretically protected doesn't mean we are. With COVID specifically, There was a lot of confusion around vaccine access and what conditions qualified you to be high risk to be placed in a more higher priority category for vaccines. There was also a lot of inherently ableist policies, where a lot of hospitals, in deciding how to triage medical resources like ventilators, several states said that people with cognitive disabilities would not be good candidates for ventilators. A couple states even said that if someone came in already on a ventilator, that the hospital reserved the right to physically take that and redistribute it to someone else who they thought would have a higher quality of life. And that's where we get tricky, because a lot of people think that quality of life when you're disabled is dramatically lowered, and that can be the case depending on where you live and what the nature of your disability and support system is. But when people are given the right support, even if they're profoundly disabled, they can still live satisfied lives even if they don't look how we imagine a regular life should look. And so the ADA has been something that's really profound, but it hasn't gone far enough in some cases in preventing discrimination to physical spaces. I've still, had places that I can't go that, I've actually put in complaints for violations of the ADA for, and one of those complaints is a pending investigation, actually, but that's been pending for several years, so we'll see if that goes anywhere. And so it's great, and it's definitely a step, particularly for those that came before me and had to fight so hard for those rights. But like everything else in the struggle for justice, it's incomplete.
Okay, I don't know if you mentioned this or not, but there was a documentary maybe in the last few years. It's called Chris Camp.
I'm still waiting to watch it. I'm so excited.
Yes,
Yes.
that's on Netflix, and it was put up for Academy Award. I don't know that it won Best Academy for Best Documentary, but it is about the fight for the Disabilities Act, and it is about all of those disabled individuals in the 50s and 60s who fought to get this act passed. And it began with all of these disabled children, who raised labeled Chris Camp in New York, who eventually became adults and began this movement for the disabled vets. And it really is enlightening of how people with disabilities were prejudiced. I mean, labeled in our society and were had no right in our society.
Yeah.
And I think about it even in our own community. We have a good school with the funding. It's on 16th Street and 16th Avenue. There's a little building that's now a daycare, but that school in the 1950s was actually a school for disabled children. Children with disabilities did not go to regular elementary. They were placed in a school of their own.
Yep.
And so a lot of story about that children. When children were then began to be placed in regular elementary. So, things have changed a lot over the years. But I was really encouraged to watch that documentary called Chris.
Yes, it's definitely on
It's enlightening the fight that individuals with disability that can find, school life.
Yeah,
You told me a really interesting thing the other day, Hannah, when you said, in heaven, I might choose to walk for a little bit just to see what it feels like, but I'm gonna be in my chair.
yeah. There's a really fascinating story that Nadia Weber, a pastor in the ELCA, told about. She was communicating with a little girl who was deaf and was using American Sign Language. And someone went up to her and said, "Oh, don't worry, honey, in heaven you'll be able to hear." And this little girl, who's my hero, responded by saying, "No, in heaven, God will sign." Yes. And so again, placing the emphasis on community versus, the individual problem that needs to be remedied in order to be part of the community. And so I'm not super jazzed about this whole heaven concept. Like, I think Judaism has the right idea when they say, like, yeah, if there's a good afterlife, great, but it's what we do here on this earth that really makes a difference, and that really matters. But, if it's all sunshine and rainbows over there and I have the option, like, yeah, I might, see how it feels to run or feel grass under my feet, but, like, I'm much more comfortable and more mobile being in my chair than I am out of it. So, it's a very important part of my life. Yeah. Yep, what do you?
You earlier referenced the Jewish rabbi as being probably the one who is giving you the most compassion and
Yeah.
what would you do if, for us as a congregation to help us to be more compassionate or to be sensitive to your needs? What do your own?
Oh, that's a deep, good question. I guess my longing is for, a congregation, yes, but also a religion more broadly. That instead of getting hung up on these theological debates about what God is, how God works in the world, and what we can do, to get to heaven or to be better Christians, is more focused on how can we help other people live our best lives. Because ultimately, I think that's what Jesus did. And I had a really interesting conversation with Nadia Weber when she came to campus. I had asked her, how do you talk about the healing narratives? Because as a disabled person, this is really hard for me. And she goes, most of the time in those narratives, it's always the crowd that brings the disabled person to Jesus. It's not the disabled person that's like, hey, please heal me, although there are a couple of examples of that. It's, the crowd wants proof that Jesus can do these amazing things. And so Jesus is like, fine, I'll heal this person. But it's not about the individual, it's about the community and getting the community to understand things that they aren't quite getting in their head. And there are a couple really good examples of one time Jesus sees a blind man and he says, "What do you want me to do for you?" And it's like, yes, that's what we want. Because everyone's different and everyone wants different things. And he says, "Please heal me." And so Jesus does. Great. But getting away from, "Oh, don't worry, God will fix it," to let's fix it now with the tools that we have and the belief that we have and the love that we have for one another. Let's make the world more just instead of let's wait for the world to become more just in God's heaven and afterlife. I guess that's my longing, if that makes sense.
Okay, Hannah,
Yeah.
if you had a magic wand, what would you do to make things better?
Always was a hard question. If I had a magic wand, I would make it so that all of the future people with disabilities, and the kids in particular, and their parents knew that there was hope. I think a lot of times, because of the medical model in our society, when, parents unexpectedly are thrown into the realm of, oh, my kid has a disability, what does this mean? The doctors are immediately like, well, they need X, Y, and Z therapies, and, these medications, and their life expectancy is gonna be this, and it's really overwhelming. Like, in my first year of life, I had like a few years of life, I had like 1,000 doctor's appointments. It was insane. And so, just telling these parents that are doing the best they can that you're gonna be okay and your child is gonna be okay. Even if their life doesn't look how you thought it would, it can still be a good and meaningful life. And especially, with kids with neurodivergencies, right? ADHD, autism, things like that. I think our tendency is, oh, we have to make them normal so that they'll fit the world. My kid is a distraction, my kid is a disruption. And it's really about saying, no, your kid belongs, even if they operate in a different way. When I was Santa Village elf when I was 15 years old, it was my first real job. A little boy came up to me and his eyes were as big as saucers, and I thought, what did I do? And this kid goes, were you kicked by a reindeer in Santa's toy shop? Is that why you're not? And that's by far the funniest response I've ever had. And I was trying to think about how to respond, but then I noticed that his sister and his mom were over in the corner, and the sister was rocking and kind of causing a scene, and the mom was really embarrassed, and my spidey senses started tingling. And so I went out on a hunch and I asked the mother, does your daughter have autism? And she said yes. And so I turned to the little boy and I go, you know how your sister's brain works a little differently, so she has to rock and make noise to calm down? And he goes, yeah. And I said, well, my brain works a little differently. So instead of walking like you walk, I have to use my wheelchair to move around. And it was a really, good teaching moment, encompassing things that he already understood in his own worldview, but just making that a little broader. Zoom folks, if you have questions, just unmute yourself and go. I don't want to exclude you.
Yeah, could
Yep.
you briefly go over the medical model versus the social model?
Yep. So medical model is the issue is fundamental to the person's body. It is you have a deficit that we need to treat to make the deficit less pronounced. So that's things like, braces or medications or therapies. And let me be clear, a lot of those things can be really good and really improve quality of life for a lot of people. But let's take it to the extreme, especially when you look at the history of certain therapies like applied behavioral analysis for individuals with autism. It becomes less about, helping the individual be their best selves and more about making them as normal as possible. And so the social model says, what can we as a society do to integrate them, provide them with the support they need to live a life that's flourishing to the best of their capabilities? Yeah.
I think we have a very good preschool here at St. John's. Have you been invited or has been any opportunity for you to talk to those kids?
Yes, and I love it dearly. Jana, a couple of years ago, the preschool director, got a grant to have dolls that came with adaptive equipment. And so I was invited to come in and explain each of those pieces of equipment to the little children. And I remember the adults were particularly nervous about one piece of equipment that was shown. It was a seizure helmet. And they were like, well, that's going to be really scary. And how do we explain to kids the seizures? And, and stuff. And maybe we shouldn't talk about it at all. And I was like, I got this. so I said, you know, if you fell on the ground and hit your head, how would that feel? And all the kids said, Dad, I would be crying and all this stuff. Right. And so when kids have a condition where sometimes they fall a lot on the ground, it would really hurt them. So how would it feel if you fell on them? And they would all say, better. Stop. I said that's what the helmet's doing for them. It's providing that layer so that it doesn't hurt them so bad. You know, things that we typically think of as frightening to kids, once you explain it to them, they're much more comfortable. Like, okay, you know, they'll ask me some questions, but then as soon as they hear that I'm in a wheelchair, they'll be like, oh, my grandma's in a wheelchair. Yes, good job, kids. Although we also have young people in wheelchairs too, but we'll get to that later. You're learning your students, it's fine. It's about learning your and so little kids are actually the best, and something we can all learn from, because as soon as I explain it to them, it's okay, you know, we're moving on, right? You can't do these things, it's fine. And I mean, I'll lift up Jeremy's daughter as a primary example of that. I get to visit Raina frequently, and I consider her my best friend, even though she's 2. I decided to take her to the park because she wanted to see the park that's right by the house. And she got really excited about the swing. And she goes, swing? And I said, Raina, I don't think I can lift you into the swing. And she goes, push it. So we just pushed it back and forth, like playing catch. You know, she fundamentally understands that there are things that I can't do and things that I can, and I'm really clear about every time she comes, I say, Raina, does Hannah walk? And she'll go, no. And I'm like, that's right, what does Hannah use? And we'll practice together. Wheelchair. Hasn't quite mastered that word yet, but I want to normalize for her that there are people who walk, there are people who roll, there are people who limp. There's a whole wide world out there, and you know, she's really good about knowing or intuiting when I'm having trouble with something, like when I'm reaching for a washcloth to wash her hands after snack time, and she'll go, Hannah, reach it? And I'm like, yep, I'm gonna reach it. We might take a while to get there, but we'll get there eventually. You know, so kids are really the best, and I think the earlier that we can integrate them and validate them, and help them understand that there are lots of people who operate in the world differently than they do, and that's okay. The earlier we're going to have a more inclusive society, and not shunning their questions too is the really important thing. I know there's a tendency to be like, oh, don't ask that, don't stare, don't point. But my favorite thing is when kids ask random questions and their parents start giving them the look of death and floundering, and I'm like, it's okay. It's all going to be okay if I can go ahead and answer that, because I'd rather them ask it in a crude or rude way based on the, you know, conceptions that they have, versus not ask it at all and grow up thinking that they can't talk about it. So I never shy away when people are like, what's wrong with you? Or why are you in a wheelchair? And the parents look like they want to melt into the floor. It's not that bad. You know, we're not going to bite. We probably have time for one more. Oh, I see a Zoom hand.
Yeah, hi, Hannah, it's Tiffany. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm going to keep my screen off because I'm drying the tears from the grace and the love I hear when you said to us parents with kids with special needs that, you know, the first thing that it's going to be okay. And so I want to thank you for that. And I want to ask, maybe you said it and I missed it as I'm parenting here, but what are you doing these days? Like, yeah, have you graduated? What's your job? Like, when are you going to start seminary? You know, I'm just curious.
So I did graduate from college. I'm currently doing part-time classes at at New York University, getting a master's in Spanish translation and interpretation. I work full-time as an administrative assistant at Concordia College, and then part-time on the weekends or as a receptionist at Eventide. I'm not sure where my life's gonna lead. I toyed with seminary a couple times, but I've also, thought about lawyer and potentially, disability services coordinator and potentially English as a second language teacher. So who knows where I'm gonna end up? But I'm really glad that I could give you the hope and validation that you needed today, Tiffany.
Thanks, Hannah. I can see why it's hard for you to decide because you have so many amazing gifts. You can make me laugh and cry and think deeply and joyfully all at the same time. So it is exciting to see where life leads you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Any final questions?
Does the Concordia College have a mobility van?
No. And don't think I haven't tried to bring that up, but as my dad likes to say, where's the money? And I said, Dad, have you tried yet? And so, before COVID, I had actually secured the funding through our Student Government Association to buy a wheelchair accessible van. But then COVID hit and everything got derailed, thanks COVID. But I would love to see one of those on campus because it's really important for social integration for students with disabilities, because I can attest that there were a lot of things that I couldn't do or couldn't get to. And not being able to hang out with your friends in their dorms because they're not accessible is really challenging. But the one time that someone provided, accessible transportation on their own without me having to ask, to attend an event, I was almost crying because I was so happy that for once I didn't have to think 10 steps ahead. I didn't have to pre-plan. I didn't have to have my mom lug me somewhere, although I had her on standby because I couldn't really believe it was going to be accessible. But it was. I had confirmation. I took pictures. And so that was a great time to feel like I could just be a human and not have to work so hard. So I would love to see that. I'd also love to see elevators in all the dorms and no more cobblestones. But as my dad says, one thing at a time. But Dad, we gotta get working on those funds. You gotta get started. You can't say wait for a donor. You gotta look for one now. Well, the funds were still there, but because everyone was so focused on COVID and how to respond in the administration, it kind of fell by the wayside, and I think the funding went back into the available. But I would love to see that be a reality someday, and I know that we probably have to get ready for the next service. So thank you so much for your time.
Here are 2 copies of the book, Sitting Pretty, that Hannah talked about briefly. We're doing in the book club. So anybody who wants these, you don't have to join the book club to get these. You just want to take them, read them, bring them back, give them to somebody else. They're open to that. And thank you again so much for the